There we go. All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Webinars with Wendy. Today, it's with me, and we're going to talk about the Feldenkrais Method. So if you've just tuned in, just let me know you don't see me or hear me. Cheryl, can you see or hear me now? Sounds like a commercial. Hopefully, everybody can. And if you are familiar with the Feldenkrais method, just pop that in the chat. I'm just curious to know if you are familiar. Because what I thought I'd do today is just kind of walk you through how I got exposed to the Feldenkrais method, what it's done for me, and then we'll do a little awareness through movement lesson as we go along. So everything is fine. Great. Thanks, Florence. So glad you tuned in. So my exposure to Feldenkrais started actually, I heard about Dr. Feldenkrais way back in probably 1982-ish. I was a research assistant at Dartmouth Medical College, and it was a time when Dr. Feldenkrais was actually doing his second practitioner training in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I heard about this man, but I was already on my way to moving down to Virginia, so I just moved on. But I recall hearing about it because somebody had said, you might want to check this out. But at that point, I was already committed to moving. In 1984, which is hard to believe that's 40 years ago now, I had a really bad riding accident where a horse reared up, flipped over, and rolled over me and punched my femur through my hip socket. And that was 40 years ago, October 3rd. So while I was in the hospital, a friend named Hunter Purdy came to me and she brought me a newsletter called the Tellington-Jones Equine Awareness Method. And that was the first time I heard of Linda Tellington-Jones. So I got really curious about it. I knew what I was doing wasn't working. I had to find another way. I started investigating the teamwork. It was called TEAM at the time, Tellington-Jones Equine Awareness Method. And I went to my first training with Linda a year later, literally a year to the day of my accident later. Not quite. Actually, it was October 4th, because on October 3rd, I went to a horse show and to celebrate the year of being back on a horse. And then I got a phone call from someone named Ellie Jensen, who was hosting the workshop, and she asked me where I was, and I thought it was starting the next day. So anyway, I drove up to Wisconsin to Ellie Jensen's place and met Linda Tellington-Jones. Got there in the evening. She was on the couch doing some T-touch with somebody. I was a research scientist. I was getting my master's degree in equine reproductive physiology. I'd been in the sciences, through college, and at that point, in undergrad and grad work. And so this was all very new and different for me. But I was curious. I was very curious. So I met Linda, and she was so unique because everything was interesting. Everything was a possibility. Everything had an opportunity. And you'd go and see a horse, and the owner would describe their horse, and, oh, this horse has this and that and the other and all these problems. And Linda would go, interesting. And at first, I just didn't understand what she was talking about. Why was she calling these things interesting? Weren't these awful problems that these people were having with their horses? Weren't they things that they were struggling with and that there didn't seem to be any help for, and that sort of thing? And then Linda would do her magic. She'd work her magic. She'd use the T-touch and the ground exercises, and the horses would change. And her work at this point in time became based on her extensive experience as a horsewoman and taking the training with Dr. Moishe Feldenkrais. So she took the 4-year training in San Francisco in the 70s. I think it was like 74 or 5 to 77, 78, somewhere in there. There was a number of people that took that training. That was his first in the United States. And so she had this very curious mind, this very interested mind as to what was going on with the horses, instead of just thinking of it as a problem, of thinking of it as an opportunity. And I think that that's one of the things that's the hallmark with Feldenkrais, is to see things as not broken, but to see things as just that you need to learn something, that it's about education and information as opposed to it's broken or something's wrong with it. In my own personal experience at that point, I had physical therapy in the hospital, and then they sent me home with no physical therapy. And what physical therapy I had in the hospital was quite aggressive, I think is the word to use, aggressive, and didn't consider me as a person. Just we had to get your knee bending because you'd been in traction. And so it set my nervous system up to be defensive and unyielding as opposed to responsive. And when you saw Linda work, you saw how the horses became responsive to her as opposed to unyielding because there's a problem. And I think that this is one of the hallmarks that Dr. Feldenkrais never saw anything as broken. He was just thinking that you needed to learn something, and that our own body is that research station where we can learn. We can use our own body as the experiment, if you will, to learn what he called new possibilities of movement. So Dr. Feldenkrais was, there's a lot of stories about his origins, somewhere in what would currently be Russia. And then when he was a young boy, he went to Palestine, and he was involved in the construction of Israel and building, literally building. He was also a soccer player and an athlete. So he was a very bright man. He went there as a boy, not even a man at the time. And at some point, he wound up going to France to study engineering. And he got a degree in engineering, and he wound up in Madame Curie's laboratory. And this was prior to World War II. And while he was there, he met the man who created judo. I seem to be freezing a lot. I wonder if it's at your end because I'm on Ethernet connection. You might want to check your end, Alex. I don't know if anybody else is having that problem. But Dr. Feldenkrais was, he was an athlete, a soccer player. He hurt his knee playing soccer. And that's where he started to explore these new ideas. But at the same time, he had met the man who created judo. And so he was trained by the number 2 to be a judo master. And he has books that he's written about judo. So, you know, if you are into martial arts and you're into judo, it would be really interesting. They're simple pamphlets, but he talked about higher judo. And that influenced his work quite a bit, because in judo, gravity is your friend. The earth is your friend. That's great. I'm glad to hear everybody's doing good over there. And when you think about it, we're so often we're terrified of falling and going to the ground. And yet that's the first thing you learn in judo is how to fall, is how to go to the ground. And so when you look at a lot of his lessons, they involve these concepts. So he pulled from judo, he pulled from sports, and he pulled from his knowledge of engineering. And when he hurt his knee, the doctor said, well, there's a 50-50 chance that surgery is going to fix your knee. And he didn't like the odds. He didn't think they were good enough. So that's when he started studying the human skeleton. And I happen to have, I'll just bring Elmer over. Here's Elmer. He happened to have the curiosity about the skeleton. And he started looking at the skeleton. He realized that there's about 205 bones. There's a couple, you could count them slightly different ways, but let's say there's 205. And then he calculated that there were 5,000 different possible ways we could organize those bones in a movement. And that when we got out of high school, we sat in desks, whatever, we started developing habits, we used only about 800 of those possibilities. And then if we have a job that's repetitive, we use fewer and fewer possibilities. And so with that loss of possibilities, there's also a loss of thought, of creativity, of movement, and that we're not achieving our full potential. So Dr. Feldenkrais, he was a really fascinating man because he studied all kinds of philosophies and religions and psychologies. And he came up with this concept that you cannot think a thought without a movement. And so rather than doing talk therapy or trying to talk through something or, go back in your past and, kind of relive all those events, his idea was that if we learn new possibilities of movement with our own body, that we could break out of these habitual thought patterns as well, that we could break out of the limitations that we hold on ourselves, that we could achieve our full potential. He's written a number of books, and I do not actually recommend you try and read them because they're so deep. He's got one called The Potent Self, Body, Mind, Body and Mature Behavior. He does have one that's a little easier to read called Awareness Through Movement. That was his first book. And he did one case study called The Case of Nora, which is the easiest to read. He was going to write a series of case studies, but he had a stroke and then that never happened. But anyway, so he started exploring these possibilities of movement. And then when World War II broke out, he was a scientist. They put all these guys on a boat. They shipped them up to Scotland. They sequestered them up there. And that's where they lived during the war. In the evenings, they got bored. And so they started sharing their pet little projects with each other. And at this point, Dr. Feldenkrais had been basically exploring this idea of new possibilities of movement. Now, what I'd like to do is give you a really simple example of a new possibility of movement. And all you have to do is take your hands and clasp them together. So if you take your hands and you clasp them together, just notice which thumb you have on top. So I happen to have my left thumb on top, okay? And this is my habitual pattern. But now what I'd like you to do is to unintertwine your fingers and then re-intertwine them so that the other thumb, in my case, the right thumb, is on top. And with that change, I just want you to notice what that feels like. Does it feel awkward? Does it feel wrong? Does it feel uncomfortable? And then just let that go and just rest for a moment. So when he's talking about habitual patterns, this is just a very simple example. And I'd like you to clasp your fingers together again. And when I do that, once again, my left thumb is on top, my habitual pattern. But then slowly take your fingers apart, and you can go as slow as you like to re-intertwine them so that the other thumb lines up on top. Not that one, but that one. Okay. And then go back to your habit. And then taking your time, going as slow as you need to, just switch back and forth a few times. Because in the end, neither one of these patterns is wrong. They're just different. But we have a habit of doing it in one way. So in this moment, we're just switching back and forth. And just notice as you do that, if it doesn't get a little easier, feel a little less awkward, give you more possibilities, and then just let that go and rest. And that's a very simple and small example of doing what's called a non-habitual movement, discovering a new possibility and recognizing that now you have the potential to do either one. So his idea was that as we learned these new possibilities, it made us more flexible, it made us more resilient and more adaptable. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind right now, especially for riders, is that we need to be more flexible, more resilient, and more adaptable because things happen, right? I'm just going to take a sip. As riders, I can't tell you how many times a rider has said to me, oh, I'm so right-handed, or oh, I'm so right-legged, or oh, that's just the way I am. But that, for our horses, is not a good service, right? We need to become more adaptable, more flexible, more integrated, if you will, so that we can ask our horse to do the things we want and not hinder them from being able to do those things because of our limitations or our habitual patterns. So Dr. Feldenkrais started teaching other people, and he realized that he could do this in groups. So there's two parts to the Feldenkrais method. think of it as a group lesson or a private lesson. A group lesson is like what we just did with our hands. You all participated with me. You could go along. I gave you the instructions on how to do it. We do it as a class. The private lessons are one-on-one. And he would think about it being communication from one nervous system to another. We do that all the time when we ride. When we get on a horse, we want to communicate from our nervous system to that of the horse. We want to be able to reassure that horse. We want to be able to give that horse information, give him guidance and direction. And so the whole idea with the one-on-ones, which is called functional integration, and he was an engineer, so function, being able to function, to move, to do things, and integration. Well, if you think about calculus, and I know for some of you that's probably like, you don't want to think about calculus ever again, but you would differentiate the curve and then integrate the area under the curve. And I don't know for certain, but I think that was his idea from a scientific perspective, that we need to differentiate to make more defined individual pieces and parts, and then integrate that back into a whole. And when you have a one-on-one lesson, a Feldenkrais lesson, that's for me at least, that's the goal, that I recognize your pattern and mirror that pattern as accurately as I possibly can, and then explore the possibilities that exist there. And in that exploration, in that level of curiosity, without thinking of anything being wrong or trying to fix anything, together we discover new possibilities. And, when I think of that for riders, I think how important that is when we're riding, that so often we want to shape the horse into a pattern without acknowledging where that horse is to start with. We are trying to make them do something because that's what we're supposed to do, as opposed to exploring, well, what are they doing? And is there something that I can do to kind of mirror that? And then in that mirroring, we come to another understanding of working together. And from there, then looking for new possibilities. And so for me, the Feldenkrais method has become almost, it's a huge part of my life. I think of it all the time in terms of the philosophy and the perspective that he came from. That when I work with a student or a rider or a horse, I'm not looking at what's wrong. I'm looking at, what do I notice? What do I see? What's happening here? And then understanding, well, why is that happening? Like, what's going on in the body? Is it that the rider's thought process isn't actually following what their body's doing, or the other way around, their body's doing something that is not what their thought process is? Okay. And then how can we discover that and then provide options? And in my teaching, I'm always telling my students, go back and forth between the old place and the new place. Like, don't take my word for it that this is better. The one who's going to vote is your horse. Your horse is going to tell you if this is easier for him, better for him, softer. And there are maybe 1% of horses that I don't let to vote, but the majority I let to vote. And then they get to show you how they're experiencing what you're doing. And so it's, in a way, when we're riding, if we think of it from this perspective, we're giving the horse a functional integration lesson, and FI is what we call it for short in the Feldenkrais world, and FI, because it's nonverbal communication. It's nervous system to nervous system. And our goal here is to be able to be aware enough to understand, well, what is the horse's body doing? What is my body doing in relation to that horse? Is there another possibility that I can do, or a way to illuminate or highlight what's happening, and then provide an option? Because in the end, the thing that we're seeking is ease. That's the one thing our nervous systems can acknowledge. It's the thing that our nervous systems can sense and feel. Now, many of us feel like, oh, I can't tell when it's easy because I'm working hard all the time. But that's where we need to like take the moment to have a way of recognizing ease, because it's that ease that we're looking for with our horses. And so many times I have a student tell me, well, you know, like when I'm on the trail, this is how I sit, you know, and I'm relaxed and I'm upright and everything's great. But I get in the arena, it's like, well, why are you different? For whatever reason of what they've been told or what they think or why they have to do it in a certain way. And yet it's that ease that we want both in the arena and outside of it. So Dr. Feldenkrais, after the war, he started teaching in the UK, and then he went back to Israel. And he was giving functional integration lessons, FIs, and he needed an assistant because he had so much work. And that's where Mia Siegel, my mentor, comes into the picture. She was actually an Alexander teacher at the time, and she had a young baby, and Feldenkrais was looking for an assistant. And I'm not sure exactly if she went to see him, but in the end, she wound up working for him. Her husband was like, you've got to go do this. And so she was his assistant for 15 years before he ever started teaching other people how to do the method. And at the end of a lesson, he'd ask her if she has any questions. And he said, if you can form the question, you already have the answer. And I think that this is another really just on a philosophical level, I guess, is something that's so key to the whole idea of learning and education, is that if we can form the question, we already have the answer. Sometimes we can't form the question. Okay, that's fair, right? At the end of my teaching, I always ask my students, do you have any questions? And often they don't have questions, but if they do, they most likely already have the answer. And so this whole idea of like self-questioning, asking ourselves what's going on, what did I feel, what did I notice, as another way to sort of become curious and explore and understand and come up with new possibilities and new ways to think and look at things. So Mia Siegel worked with him for 15 years. She did go off to Japan. She became a black belt judo master, which is pretty amazing. But when he came to the United States to teach the training that Linda Tellington-Jones attended, Mia was his assistant. And Linda took Mia out to work on a horse. And Mia was like, I don't know anything about horses. And she said, think of it like a person. So Mia and Linda got together in that training, and they're still great friends. And I've studied with Mia extensively, and I think of her as my mentor in the Feldenkrais world. I've had many other teachers, but Mia is the person to me that embodies this work in a way that resonates with me. Her sense of curiosity and joy, whether she was in the classroom or having a cup of tea with you, never varied. She was the same person both in the classroom and outside. And I'm sure you've seen those teachers that you absolutely love in one environment or the other, but they're not the same in both. And I think that there's something about that is important to notice. But she is so genuine, and just, she also felt like anybody could do this work. It's not rocket science. It's not unique. It's not special. It does take training, because in the training, what is so important is to learn how to be a good observer. So Feldenkrais would say, you can't do what you want until you know what you do. If you don't know you keep hiking one shoulder up, you can't do anything about it because you don't notice it. But once you notice it, then there is a possibility to do something. And I think that's also one of the keys in the Feldenkrais method, and something that we could all use a little more of in our daily life, in our work with our horses, is to become a little more self-observant and also observant of our horses. So often we're in a hurry. We're trying to get something done. We've got this project, or we've got this show, or we've got this whatever. And we have to the goal becomes the mission instead of noticing the process along the way. So if anybody has any questions at this point, just pop in the chat. But what I'd like to do is a little awareness, another little awareness through movement lesson with you. And we can talk about, or I can talk about, you can chime in about how that felt. And somebody's got their hand up. Rhonda, did you want to say something? Or are we all good? I think we're all good. Okay. So just sit in a comfortable chair, away from the back of the chair, not resting on the back. So just sitting upright, finding your seat bones underneath you. And then just think about, if I don't have a clock handy, but if you took a clock, a dial clock, not a digital clock. And that's one of the things that's happened now, is that most people think of clocks as digital, but we got to go back to the old dial clock. And if you thought of a dial clock and you just thought about placing that dial clock on your, right here at the top of your arm, okay, on the side. Now, depending on which shoulder you put it on, it's going to depend on where some of the hours are, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. And so just take a moment to close your eyes, notice your breathing, because that is the easiest way to notice ease, by the way. This whole idea of what is easy? How do we feel ease? What is it that our nervous system is attuned to? And that breath is the thing that we can use to sense our own inner ease. So then just close your eyes and notice your breathing. And whichever shoulder you put the clock on, just think about that shoulder for a minute. And then if we said that 12 o'clock was toward the ceiling, up toward the sky, and 6 o'clock was toward the floor, we're going to use those hours on the clock. And so then very slowly, just letting your arms rest on your legs, your forearms and your hands. So, or you can let your arm hang down totally, whichever is the most comfortable for you. Just very slowly and in a very small increment, think like 1/4 of an inch. Just begin to raise that shoulder up toward 12, that little tiny bit, and return. And just do this a few times. So why a few times? Because this isn't exercise. We're not trying to strengthen anything or train anything. We're just bringing in our awareness. And then rest, meaning rest however you like. So we're going to do a little tiny movement and then a rest. The rest is so important. And I think that this is also really critical when we're training our horses. We tend to think, oh, I've got to keep going. I've got to get this circle better. I've, got to sort out this whatever. But so often, if we take that pause, that moment, that breath, that rest, it gives our brain and our body a chance to process what is it we're talking about, that little piece of information. And then we can come back to it and do a little more and see how things have changed. So once again, just come upright, sitting on your seat bones, your arms wherever it's most comfortable, either hanging straight down or the forearm resting in your lap. And once again, move the shoulder up toward 12, just that little bit. So most people think, oh, I've got to do a lot. But really, it's by reducing the effort that you're going to notice more. So this is another principle with the Feldenkrais method, is that less is more. That just by doing a small movement a few times, and what you really want to do is lift and pause and then lower and pause. So it's not a continuous movement. It's a distinct, actually 2 movements. One is the lift and one is the lower. And as you do that, just notice what happens to your breathing. Is there anywhere that you feel tension? Do you feel anything get tighter or looser? And can you actually go slower so that you have the moment to feel what's happening? And then let that go and rest again. So here there's some of the basic principles: going slowly, doing less, pausing, and resting. And again, I think that we get so into this idea of exercise that we have to do more, it has to be bigger, it has to be more effortful, that we lose the subtleties. We lose the refinement. We lose all these other possibilities. And we're just exploring 1 hour right now, just going to 12 and returning to middle. But you could slice this in smaller and smaller increments as we go along into half hours and quarter hours and all that. And then you gain so much more complexity, not complexity, difficult complexity in terms of opportunities and possibilities. Okay, so once again, come up on your chair. Okay, have your arm resting. And this time, think of going down a little towards 6 o'clock. And again, just doing what's easy. So if you start to feel tension in the upper neck, pause. If it's painful, absolutely stop. Okay, but pause and see if you go slower or do less. How can you make this movement easier? And by reducing the effort, you start to notice the places that are either getting involved that don't need to be involved. You might notice something around the neck area, something around the collarbone, maybe into the shoulder blade. And just think, well, if you could make this movement a little simpler, a little slower, a little easier, and then let that go and rest. So Dr. Feldenkrais, he came back to Israel. He was working a lot. Mia Siegel was his assistant. And then he was starting to be invited into different places. He went to Esalen, did a workshop in Esalen. And then he came to California and did his 4-year training in California. That's when Mia and Linda met. And then his second professional training was at Amherst, the place where I heard he was going to be. But then I just continued on down to Virginia. During that second training, he had a stroke. He was a smoker, and he had a stroke. And so he didn't actually complete that training. Some of his people that had been with him in California finished the training. But that was the formation, if you will. There's a lot of trainers that came from those two, some of whom are still practicing, still training, still teaching. I did my training, my 4-year Guild Certified training, which is in the United States. You need to be Guild Certified, with a man called David Zemock-Burson, and he was in San Francisco along with Linda and also at Amherst. So there's a lot of history and a lot of connections when you start to get into the Feldenkrais world with these two trainings and with the people that attended them, who then became sort of the seniors of the method in the United States. Mia has gone on and she taught a lot in Europe. She taught in Germany quite a bit, did a number of trainings, I think also Switzerland. So there's a number of people that have been trained by Mia that are in Europe. There are practitioners all around the world, and you can always look for one in your area by going to feldenkrais.com. I'll spell that. It's FELDENKRAIS.com. That's in the United States. And I think you just have to Google it for looking in other countries. All right, so come out to your seat bones again. Have your arm in that comfortable place. And just close your eyes for a moment and just feel the difference between your two shoulders. So we've only done a very tiny little bit of movement, really not a lot at all. But just notice if there's any difference now between the way the shoulder that we've done a little bit of pelvic clock with and the one we haven't. And I call it pelvic clock because this idea of a clock is used with the pelvis. We're doing obviously a shoulder clock, but you can use the clock as an image. And it's something I think that's one of Dr. Feldenkrais's most brilliant ideas, is this idea of using a clock to orient and then to explore. So just coming up and sitting again, if you think of doing the hours of 6 and 12 now. So you're just going to go a little down to 6 and return, and then up to 12 and return. And again, just doing what's easy. So how do we sense ease? I mean, I think that's one of the biggest questions is notice your breathing. And if you find that you're holding your breath, then the movement may not be easy. So I've been around a lot of people that talk about breathing over many years. There's so many different ways that we can breathe, styles that we can breathe. But my conclusion is that the most natural breath is that of ease. In other words, when you're doing something that's so easy and simple, you're not trying to breathe, you're simply breathing. And it's not an effortful breath, it's just a breath. So as you do this little movement of 6 and 12, pausing at either end and in the middle, just notice if you can do that and make it so pleasurable, so enjoyable, that it's really just simple and fun. And of course, you can rest whenever you need to. And just take a moment once again to feel the difference between your two shoulders. Like just doing this with you, I already feel a great difference in the way my right shoulder, which is the one I've been doing the little clock with, versus the left. It just feels like it's longer, lower, hanging more. And I did notice that there's some tension in my neck area and around my shoulder blade when I did these movements. And I thought I was fine, right? Until we actually have the moment to investigate and explore. All right, let's see. Oh, Joanna Lowe. Oh my goodness. Okay, so Linda Richard just said, I'm very fortunate to have Joanna Lowe working with myself and my horse. She worked with you. Yes, Joanna was one of my, she came down and she was an intern. And then she went on and took the Feldenkrais training. So you must say hello to her for me. All right, so once again, just coming upright. Now you're going to think about, and depending on which shoulder you're doing, the clock for 3 and 9. So I'm going to say toward the front of the body or the back of the body because it's different on the two shoulders. This is where the clock is a little bit different. So just sit quietly on your seat bones with your arms resting and very slowly think about bringing the point of your shoulder a little forward. Okay, so if I were to put my finger, like I'm going to follow my collarbone and kind of come down a little bit to the most forward point of my shoulder, I'm going to think of moving from there. Okay, and I'm just going to think about bringing it a little forward and pausing and returning and just doing that a few times. Again, noticing breathing. And where can you, what we say is reduce the effort. Is there some place that you can let go of to make this simpler and easier? Maybe you're just tightening your chest a little bit, or maybe you're holding your back a little bit strongly. Just see if there's somewhere that you can reduce the effort and make this a lighter, easier movement. And then pause. And then you're going to take the shoulder back a little bit. So if you think about drawing it on a line back, you might notice that something has to get longer along the front of your body. And so when we start to pay attention to simple things, what I mean by that is, what gets longer? Does something get shorter? Does it get heavier or lighter? It doesn't have to be complicated to bring in awareness. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I noticed 6,000 different things and oh, that affected. I mean, it's great if you do notice all those things, right? But sometimes it's just keeping it really simple and just noticing if anything gets wider or longer or shorter, and then let that go and rest. And so it's using this very simple image of a clock and then thinking of taking the shoulder to those different points. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my skeleton on this. Here we are. Okay. And I just want to look at this for a second because this is the structure we're talking about. And here is our collarbone. And it's going from the connection at our sternum and across to the shoulder blade. So when you put your hand on the top of your shoulder here, you're putting it on the top of the shoulder blade. You're not actually at the joint. The joint is, I call this a ledge, and the joint is below the ledge. And the socket, I can move his shoulder joint, which you don't want to do, but the socket is here and it's very shallow. So it's a ball and socket joint, and it's underneath the ledge of the shoulder blade, which of course goes around to the back. So if we think about these little movements that we've been doing, we did, let's see if I can just do that. I'm going to stabilize him a little because he doesn't have any muscles. Okay. So if we were going to 12 o'clock and return, and 12 and return, you can see that just that little movement is going to influence the collarbone. It's going to influence the shoulder blade. And so there's a lot going on. There's obviously muscles all the way up here. He just has little bungee cords. Okay. But there's a lot going on there. And then when we slide down to 6, again, there's something that's going to happen in the collarbone. There's something that's going to happen with the shoulder blade. And so when we do 12 and 6, we see that there's this little bit. And again, doing the small, slow movements so that you don't start engaging a lot of these muscles up in the neck. What we're trying to do is actually make this softer and easier and not so effortful. When we think about going forward and back, look at how the shoulder blade slides that tiny little bit as we go forward, and it slides a little bit as we go back. So forward and back, and then up and down. And so this is, with that small, simple movement, this is the structure, the part of our body that we're influencing, that, you know, when you think about it, the poor shoulders suffer all the time. They suffer from our purses. They suffer for our sacks of grain. They suffer for our grocery bags or doing the key on the door. The shoulders really have a tough job. And our shoulder is designed to give us so much possibility of movement. It's called brachiation, right? So that we can do big sweeping movements with our arm. But if we misfire, we wind up with tension and muscles firing not at the right time, but at the time that actually can cause restriction in movement. All right, so once again, just come up on your chair and just think about doing your little movement. You're going to go 12 and 6, 3, return to middle, and 9. And just, again, notice if this is a little bit easier now that you've had a little rest. Is it a little clearer? Can you make it simpler? Do you need to go slower? Where can you make this movement so enjoyable and so simple and so easy that you could then start thinking about making a circle so that you would come up and back and down and forward. Just, it could be a circle the size of a dime, a circle the size of a pencil eraser. It doesn't have to be a big circle. And this is another thing where sometimes we think we have to make these really big movements. But if we want to train all the little tiny postural muscles and the little muscles that have to coordinate perfectly, then we need to really look at making these movements slow and soft and easy. We can then take them into larger movements. All right, and then just rest. And once again, notice the difference in your two shoulders. Now, we're only going to do the one shoulder here in this webinar. And there's a reason for that. Because contrast is another great way to make things clearer and easier and simpler. In other words, if we just do one side, later on today, you're going to be going through your day, through your activity, and you might notice, wow, this one side feels like so nice and it's moving so freely, and the other one feels really sticky. And it's that contrast that is so important for the nervous system to recognize what is happening. In order to change something, it has to come up and be conscious. And I think that this is so often, if you listen to any of the books on changing habits, You have the trigger, the routine, and the reward. And those are the three kind of primary things in a habit. But if we're going to change a habit, what happens is that it has to become conscious. We have to notice it. And so by taking this little time, slowing things way down, making this little tiny circle, feeling what's happening. In fact, that's another great thing. You come up to sitting and just take your other hand and place it on the collarbone and just rest it to the shoulder. And as you make that little circle with the one that you're touching, you can feel the movement of the collarbone, just like I showed on the skeleton. You can feel the movement of the shoulder blade if you just put your hand right on top. You can feel where it gets sticky and where you can make it easier. And so it's this awareness. That's what Feldenkrais recognized. His group lessons are called awareness through movement, that we need to become aware of the possibility or what we're doing, and then have a choice. And in that choice, then our nervous system is going to seek ease. And this is what's so amazing with the horses, is the horses will give it up so fast if something is easier. We as people tend to go, oh, I can't do that. Can't tell you how many times I've gotten a rider to soften the chest and lengthen their back a little bit. And then they're like, no, I can't do that. I have to sit up. And it's like, why? Because I was told I got to sit up. That's how I look pretty and like correct. And I'm like, really? What does your horse say? And your horse says, wow, when you soften your chest and lengthen your back, it's a lot easier for him to do the same. And yet we have this overriding self-image that says, oh, but this is how we're supposed to be. The beauty of horses is they don't do that. You know, if we show them another possibility, something that's easier, as long as there is no pain, they will go to that ease. They will seek that ease. We have so much we could learn from the horses about change if we just looked at how quickly they will respond to something that's easier. And so that's a lot what Linda Tellington-Jones's work is about, is bringing in that awareness, just like we did with the shoulder circles, whether it's a leg circle with the horse, whether it's the labyrinth or the T-touch. And as we do that, we are the observer, and in that observation, things can change. So I'm sure that Dr. Feldenkrais knew about quantum theory because he was so much about the observation, the awareness. And if you don't observe it, then does it really exist? I mean, that's the conundrum from the tree falling in the woods. And if nobody's there to hear it, did it make a sound? But there's so much to that, is that as we observe, then there's a possibility of something happening. But if we can't see it, if we don't feel it, if we haven't experienced it, if we're too busy doing other things to notice, then we don't have that possibility for bringing in change. And with the possibility of change and with the new potential, the new ease of moving your shoulder, that influences everything in your body. That influences your nervous system. It influences your fascia. I did this fantastic webinar on the ligaments. And I'm really wondering if all this work isn't also resetting the ligaments, because it's all connected. You can't isolate one from the other. And so often we want to let the limitations constrain us. We want to let the limitations hold us back. We want to say that, oh, there isn't a possibility, or, oh, we can't do anything different. And yet all the possibilities, all the options, they're right here. And by exploring new possibilities of movement with our own body, it lets us bring about change in our life. It lets us see new opportunities. It lets us experience different things. And that, I think, is his work on another level was so amazing, because his concepts become a way of moving through the world, of asking questions, of exploring, of not just accepting that this is the way this is right now, that maybe there's a possibility of change. And so it's just a fascinating thing for me. It's been almost 40 years that I've been experiencing and exposed to and working with the Feldenkrais method now. And I can't even begin to say how it has allowed me to be curious instead of judgmental, and looking for options instead of just saying, well, that's the way it is. And I think now is a time for where we have to look for those new possibilities, both in our own lives and in the community around us, and keep exploring. So if anybody has any questions, Dr. Feldenkrais obviously passed. I think it was in 1984 or 5. But he was so curious to the end. You know, he wanted to see what was going to happen with the election and at that time in his time. And that is what I think kept him so youthful. So if anybody has any questions, just pop it in the chat there. And there is one other thing that actually, let's see, Wendy, have you trained any trainers based on in the UK? I have not taught anybody in the UK. I have gone over and done a Surefoot workshop, and Surefoot is totally based on the Feldenkrais method and my experience with the Feldenkrais method. And I will be going back over to the UK to do another Surefoot workshop. I think it's in May. So I don't know if I'm going to be doing any riding workshops, but it would certainly be fun to do some. So maybe stay in touch and we'll see how that's going to work out. There is one other concept that Dr. Feldenkrais talked about, and I think that it's also extremely important, and it's the concept of reversibility. The concept of reversibility. In my own personal life, when that horse went up, I had no possibility of reversing it, right? And so bad things happened. And he would talk about the ability to go forward, to stop, and go back. That you are never so out of balance that you were completely committed and you could not reverse. And when you think about our work with horses so often, you see people who get to the point where that is not an option. Reversibility, to stop, to wait, is no longer an option. And I think of it as riders is our ability to wait, to not act. And so often it's in that ability to either take a step back, to pause, to then wait and not be out of balance in a position where we are falling and have to act, whether that's we're on the horse and we're so off balance that we must act by pulling on the rein or gripping with a leg, or that, you know, we've gotten to the place where the horse is unable to respond. Great. And so that's one thing, that's another concept of his that I really do think about a lot. Do I use Feldenkrais practice on myself every day? So yes and no. And what do I mean by yes and no? The concepts of it are I use every day. And when I'm teaching a lesson, I'm using Feldenkrais with every single student every day. When I feel like I need something, I'll get on the floor and do an awareness through movement lesson. I can, you know, spend 5 minutes. I was having some problem with my left knee, and I got on the floor and did a very simple awareness through movement lesson and found out, wow, these ribs over here are sore. And by the time I got done, the ribs weren't sore and the knee wasn't bothering me. And then I could put weight on my leg and I was fine. I think that ties into the fact that it's all connected. Would I explain how I came up with the pads? And I'm not sure what my reflection routine is, what you mean by that, Florence. But so I came up with the Surefoot pads because as a Feldenkrais practitioner, I've been doing a lesson that I call grounding the foot. It's based on Dr. Feldenkrais's lesson called the artificial floor, where you take a board and you place it on the person's foot. And since we have what's known as a seeking mechanism, the foot seeks contact with the ground. The foot seeks contact with the board, whether it's the Feldenkrais lesson laying down called, I just lost the name, or whether it's with a rider in the saddle. And that seeking of the leg is how I've used that for 22 years to get riders to let go in the leg and have the draped leg that everybody wants. It's not by trying harder, it's by doing less, but we have to know where is less. How do we seek less? so that the leg can drape. And the board under the foot lesson that I came up with is just, it works like magic. It's great. It's my kind of, party trick. No matter what, I can pull that one out and make a difference to a rider. So it was from that lesson of how, like I do this with the rider and they ground and everything's awesome. And then I had a horse that was, I would see him once a month, and I would see him for 2 days in a row, Monday, Tuesday. And on the Monday he came and he was lame in the right hind leg. The owner had changed the saddle, and she had a jumping saddle, which turned out to be crooked and was putting pressure on that back right quarter. We switched back to the dressage saddle because she had it with her, and he was still showing, he was short. He was looking lame. So that night I was talking to Dr. Joyce Harmon, and she wanted to stand at her computer instead of sit. And so we got talking about pads that she wanted to stand on. And while we were talking about that, she told me how they were putting dogs on different surfaces for rehabilitation. And I said to her, do you think it would work for a horse? And she said, I don't know, but time it for 15 seconds. So I grabbed a pad out of my shed. I drove to the lesson. The rider was already on board. I walk up. I tell her I'm going to do this weird thing. All my students are used to me doing weird things. I picked up the foot, put the pad down, timed it for 15 seconds, and he walked off perfect. And I spent the next hour just playing with him, and he's totally sound. And then the next horse I had for a lesson was a quarter horse who had been done Western Pleasure, and she wanted to event. He had a terrible canter. I did pads with him, and we had a beautiful canter. The next horse was a Haflinger, and I did the same thing, and we had a round canter. So now I was hooked. And the owner of the third horse, her name's Catherine Wyckoff. She's a fellow Feldenkrais practitioner and PT, and just a brilliant woman. And she and I looked at each other and were like, wow, what is this? And so from there, I just started experimenting and playing with as many horses as I could, and Surefoot was born. And again, it was, I had no preconceived notions. I went into it totally curious. I went into it without an expectation. I just wanted to investigate. And I think, that's the Feldenkrais philosophy, is just explore and be curious. And the result was so surprising, so astounding, that I was just, in an instant, I was captured. And there's only twice in my life when that's happened. The first time was when the horse rolled over me and punched my femur through my hip socket. In 15 seconds, he changed my life. And this time was 15 seconds, and it changed my life. And I'm still, every time I do pads with a horse, I'm still fascinated. I'm curious. I'm wondering how this horse is going to respond, what they're going to show me, which foot, how long, whether they, want the pads or not. And I think it's one of the reasons that Surefoot is, it's in a way, it's out of the box, but it's totally not out of the box, right? It's coming from a place of curiosity. And when we approach our horses in that childlike innocence, that childlike curiosity, without the expectations of, they have to do this, then they start participating with us and showing us different things that we might never expect. And I find that the horses so appreciate being asked instead of told. They so appreciate a conversation that offers something that feels good to them without any strings attached. That, we're not bribing them in any way. If they say no, they say no, and it's totally cool, right? And I've had horses say no, and it's okay. But when we come with that curiosity and willingness to accept whatever they say, and no, I can't. I have a lot of horses that say no, I don't want that, and then I let them go for a walk, and I come back and I say, well, how about now? And they're like, oh yeah, now it's okay. Just giving them the opportunity to say no is also so important. So that's where Surefoot got started. It's just, every day, it makes me smile to think about all the horses that it's helping, and how it's changing people's perception. I don't know if you guys participated in the survey that I did with the giveaway for a pair of Surefoot pads. And I think for me, the best thing was all the people that told me how Surefoot's benefiting their horses. Like, it was supposed to be for people that didn't have pads yet, but all these other people chimed in. So I just opened it up to everybody. But how people are so curious and interested in the communication, in the dialogue with their horse, and how each horse is allowed to be unique in their response. And I think for me that's the thing that makes me smile more than anything, is to know that they're being heard, that we allow them to say what they like, what they don't like, and that we provide them with something that they value. So, all right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about Feldenkrais. And I will get this up, and we'll probably put a link to how you can find out more about the Feldenkrais method. All right. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.